I'll make this as quick, as brief as possible about me, so we can turn it over to our panel. My daughter went through the ISD and is now in college, and I talk to a lot of parents and friends of mine who think about putting their kids in DISD and struggle with that for a lot of reasons. And I always tell them the same thing, which is walk the halls. You get a sense of how a school's energy, of how the kids are, if they're just sort of slumped in chairs and not listening. What we want to do today is we'll probably start off talking about the news, about the push to have enough petition signatures to call for a commission to look at the DISD charter and suggest changes to that for a home rule district. It would be the first one in Texas. But I want to use it as a way to get into the complexity of the challenges that affect DISD right now, and the reason these challenges are so great in terms of graduating more students that are college ready, which is really the ultimate goal. So with that, I'll let everybody, if you would, I'll let you introduce yourself, tell us what you do, how you got here, and sort of what I'd be interested in initially is, what is sort of your driving focus these days in your role? We'll start with Rena.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Rena Honey. I grew up in Dallas, went to Dallas schools, graduated from Dallas ISD schools. I am president of Alliance AFT. We are the largest organization that represents school employees. We're talking about developing the minds of people that are going to grow up and be the leaders for us as adults. They are going to grow up to make decisions that will hopefully help you and I as we get older. And we want them to be the best that they can be.
I'm a school board member. I represent District 2. I decided to run for the school board 3 years ago. I ran a small software company that streamlined a federal child nutrition program. So we helped feed low-income kids all around the country and helped reduce the cost of government in the process. I came out of high school with 36 hours of college credit because of my phenomenal public school education. I was heads and shoulders above my peers in college that were elite prep schools. And on top of that, I got a much more well-rounded education than they did, because that's what public school gives you. So I'm a huge public school advocate, but I recognize that our public schools are very far from perfect in Dallas. When I look at my life and I compare the lives of my two little brothers, I ask about homework, or I ask about the degree of challenge. I ask what it is that they find engaging in school. And I don't get good answers from those questions. What became clear to me over time is that nobody laid hands on these kids and said, "You are mine. I am not going to let you pass by me. You are going to be a success."
So my name is Tarek Ward. I am Co-Chief Operating Officer of the Commit Partnership here in Dallas. We are a partnership of about 110 organizations, including school districts, nonprofits, foundations, early childhood centers, everybody that's got a stake in education. And, we try to bring everybody to the table and use the best data we have available and the best local expertise to try to help our kids and try to help make sure every student has an opportunity to graduate from high school and do whatever it is that they can do to be productive and happy citizens. So that's kind of what I do every day. My path to education was a little bit different. I'm an engineer by training and trade. So I'm not from Texas, but I got here as soon as I could. So I was in Houston for about 10 years. I was an engineer at NASA. So I'm a former fully certified rocket scientist. Yeah, so I was the flight controller for the International Space Station for many moons in a former life. And when I walked into a lot of classrooms, I was a unicorn. I was a mythical creature that walked into the classroom, and I said to them, I'm a rocket scientist. I fly spaceships for a living. And they were quizzical looks and said, well, wait, we're going to time out for a second. What do you mean? Because I've never met a rocket scientist, but this is not what I envisioned. And, we would have to spend a lot of time talking about what was possible. what was real. I don't need you to be a rocket scientist, but I need you to know that you could if you wanted to. And that was a conversation I had to have, too many times. What you can see is that there are a lot of good things happening. And part of what we try to do is make sure that we understand where those good things are happening, shine a big, bright spotlight on those things, and really learn.
So these are three very passionate people who clearly care a lot about kids and education. But let's set the landscape a little bit. Let's see some of those numbers that are scary, right?
Right.
That suggest there are real fundamental problems that need to be addressed here in terms of what happens at the end of this cycle. 7 of 100 kids who graduate DISD, right, are college ready. In terms of how poor these kids are who come through DISD. 89%, last number I saw, 89% of them on free or reduced lunch programs. That's higher than Houston. That's higher than anybody else in the state.
Let me jump in with a couple of these numbers that are particularly compelling. So the level of college readiness in DISD today is actually about 8 out of 100. But if you go back 20 years ago, it was 7 out of 100. So we have passed an entire generation of children and not seen any material change in output. When you begin to look at subgroups, so let's split out our white kids from our black and Hispanic kids, because white kids in DISD are only about 4 or 5% of our kids. The numbers drop, it's to closer to 4 out of 100, not 7 or 8 out of 100. And in fact, if you look at the gap in performance between, say, black students and Hispanic students and their white peers, it is actually worse today than it was 20 years ago. So we have made progress. Graduation rates are up. Overall college readiness is up. But the gains for our neediest kids, the kids that we as a, you think about the mission of public education, what we want to do is make sure the next generation of Americans are better suited for success than the last generation of Americans. But what we are in fact doing is creating a permanent underclass, because the gap between the haves and the have-nots in the last 20 years educationally has only gotten worse. And as those kids grow up, that's going to become manifest in the economy as a whole.
Jim Schutz has described it as a pipeline to prison for young black males in DISD. So given that context, let's talk about home rule. An effort has come up that sort of sprung up out of nowhere, which is one of the problems people have with it, financed by we're not sure whom, which is another problem that people have with it, to get 25,000 signatures per state law that say we want to take a look at changing the way, the structure, and free ourselves from some of the rules, not the accountability rules, but rules that prevent us from implementing some reform efforts in Dallas, in DISD. For example, longer school years. Right now we're constricted. We can't have longer school years for a lot of reasons. So how did this come about, and what is its aim and effort as far as you know, Mike?
But it allows the school system to do two things. Removes a bunch of legal restrictions that the state legislature has imposed on the school system. For example, there's a law that prevents us from starting school before the 4th week of August, which is totally ridiculous, and home rule sort of exempts the school system from that. It also exempts the school system from a bunch of labor laws, which I think Rena will certainly comment on here in a moment. That doesn't mean that the school system would in fact be exempt from those, because even though it allows you to be exempt from those, what actually has to happen is a sort of constitution has to be drafted. So there's two things that it does. One is it exempts you from a variety of state laws, none of which have to do with funding, none of which have to do with teacher retirement, none of which have to do with accountability, but there are other laws that it exempts you from. But it also allows you to change your governance structure. And that is a big open question, and nobody knows what that means. But if any of you have ever attended a DISD board meeting, I would assume that you have come away with the conclusion that we can probably improve our quality of governance, because we spend 7.5 hours arguing over some of the most meaningless details imaginable, rather than talking about strategies to close the achievement gap. We have elections every single year, so a third of us are always campaigning. The accountability that we have is limited to about 2% of the voters in the city of Dallas. And if they're interested in moving student achievement, then they'll try to have that reflected in their elected official. But many times they're not necessarily interested in improving student outcomes. So I would certainly be interested in having this constitutional committee review ways to help align our interest as elected officials with the interest of our kids. Because that's ultimately what has to happen. When we make decisions that are in the best interest of kids, good things can happen. When we make our decisions that are in the best interest of adults, good things may happen, but they may not. There's no compelling requirement for school board members to actually act in the best interest of kids. And I think that it's absolutely unacceptable that we as a city have allowed this achievement gap to widen for the last 20 years. We have allowed generations of bright-eyed little kids in Dallas to go through a system that inadequately prepares them to read and write, much less participate in the modern economy. And we as a collective body, we as a community, have never said enough is enough. We have never said what we want is we want a system that is constantly focused on improving outcomes for kids. And I can tell you that does not happen at Ross Avenue because we as elected officials do not focus on that. And we get what we want. We get what we deserve in this democracy. And we've never had a conversation as a city about what can we do to come together as a city to solve the most pressing problem in America, which is how can we make sure that these little bundles of energy that are 2 and 3 years of age end up being self-aware members of our republic after 18 years of education. And that is ultimately what the home rule conversation is about. It is saying that we have got to have a conversation as a city about what is in the best interest of our kids and how we can organize ourselves effectively. And there is going to be vehement disagreement on how to organize ourselves effectively. 2% of the people determine who is elected, and then we spend all of our time talking about crap. So we've got to talk about what can we do for our kids, and thank God this opportunity has come along for our city because it will give us a chance to do that.
I agree that the conversation should be about children, but adults are playing games with children's lives, and it's been going on for this 20 years. The people that are there are the ones that can buy their way in a lot of the times, not every time, but the people that usually wind up being in the conversation are not the ones that are in the classrooms or in the schools that know what works for children. They draw up these great plans on paper. They think they've thought through everything, but the very people that understand what happens in these classrooms are not at the table. They've not been invited, or they've been invited at a time that they couldn't attend, and their input is not there. But when you're playing adult games with children's lives, it gets tainted, and our kids are the ones that are suffering every single day. The legislature has gotten involved. They listened to people that had the money, that could bend their ears, that could help them get elected to office, that are not educators. If we wanted a true conversation that would be meaningful, every elected official in this state and in this city should have to be in our classrooms every single month or quarter to be a substitute teacher to see what they have done, how it is implemented in the classrooms. That's where the breakdown comes in. Maybe it is something that's really good, but the implementation is the problem. When you've got people that think my way is better so I don't have to listen to them and I know I can do it because nothing's going to happen to me, that's how we've gotten where we are today.
So, Rena, your fear in this process, we put together a commission and the board selects the commission,
No,
correct?
right. I started to say, we as a people don't get to do that.
Right.
If this passes, first the signatures have to be gained. They have to have enough signatures. Only 5% of the voting of the registered voters in Dallas.
Which is actually more than has ever voted for a school board election in the history of Dallas.
Last May, we had 4.2 or 4.6% of the registered voters step out to go to the ballot box for the school board elections. That's the least number that has been in the last 10 years.
And so the concern is that the very people we say, I can't spend 8 hours a week talking over things that aren't about kids would be deciding this commission that put
Actually, the school board trustees would be appointing this commission.
Right.
They would not be elected. There's a formula. Only 4 educators have to be on that group of 15. So you've got non-educators making huge decisions for kids that are going to be in schools and for the educators that are taking care of them and doing the implementation for what they're going to do.
Let's assume that a group of people who do not have the best interests of kids, that are looking out for their own interests, or are just reformers to be reformers and putting in programs that sound good on paper but don't work. Let's say they come out with a document that puts together things that your group does not believe work in the real world. Can't voters just then decide not to implement them?
They could.
Either the board has to decide to do this on its own, or the board has to be presented with a petition to do this. And when that happens, then the board, the elected officials, appoint a blue ribbon commission to do what is effectively a constitutional convention. A minimum of 4 of those folks have to be classroom teachers. And I will say I completely agree with Rena. I think every legislator and every policymaker that is involved in education needs to spend at least 1 day a quarter in a classroom. I mean, I spend basically every Monday at Mott Elementary at tutoring kids, but for that purpose, because this is the most complicated endeavor I've ever been exposed to. Teaching is a massively complicated process, and I think.
But let me interject. Tutoring is very different
Than
from being
teaching.
responsible for the lesson plans, the meetings that you have to do,
Absolutely.
having every child learn differently, and being able to reach each of those children. We don't even talk about the social emotional piece of this for those kids. They have been
totally agree.
reduced to a number, what data says. Data can give you all kinds of information, but if you're not there with that single child, you don't know what they bring to the table. You don't know the baggage that they have been through the night before that comes into the classroom the next morning.
We were talking about that in the hall, right? The kid comes in with their gums bleeding. Kid comes in, one of their parents was arrested last night. Kid comes in. These are that doesn't get away. You've still got your lesson plan. You've still got the things that have been foisted upon you to get done. Those are some of the real world challenges that you feel won't be at the table
Absolutely not.
in this sort of restructure.
And we have a standards-driven educational system defined out of Austin that defines what kids need to know in every single subject academically for every year of their life. Home rule, incidentally, will exempt us from that and allow us to look at new standards for our kids, or new approaches to education. And the social emotional health issue is a big deal. If think about what it is to you to be successful. Part of that is your English skills, your math, your science, your social studies. But a lot of that has much broader to do with that. It's the ability to look a man in the eye and shake his hand and keep your word. It's about grit and perseverance. It's about gratitude and optimism, and that is not part of the state's curriculum standards. And so we need to locally look at how we can use all of our knowledge. What teachers know, what they've known for generations, is that you got to educate the whole child. And yet our system of standards focuses solely in the academic to the detriment of all these social emotional skill sets.
Right, and that's really important, because I think one of the things that is really easy a trap that's really easy to fall into is kind of looking at the data. We're a data-driven organization, but I think one thing that we've acknowledged, and I think that's really important to this story, is first acknowledging the complexity of it. Right, this is a system, and this is a hugely complex system, and behind every number is a set of other numbers, and behind all of those numbers are stories, and behind all and those are people, right? So one of the things that we've been very diligent about is that for every number we really try to uncover what's behind that. So we go and we talk to the educators, and we visit the schools and try to figure out what's going on behind this, and we try to shed some light on this. So one of the things we did, we've written some case studies and some stories of impact to really lift the cover, right? Try to figure out what's behind some of these numbers, right? And when you look at this whole system, it's really important to always put it in context, right? So a lot of the things we'll talk about the achievement gap, right? It's a thing, it's this ethereal thing that we feel and we talk about, but it gets interesting when you start to zoom out and you realize that gap doesn't appear, right? It starts very, very early. When we look at our children coming in kindergarten ready, less than half of them come in ready to learn. That gap starts instantly.
And we as a city we as a school board have never had a conversation about substantially increasing our coverage in early childhood education. We don't. I mean, we have the resources. There's $60 million a year being left on the table for us to expand coverage in pre-kindergarten for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds in DISD. This money's been on the table for like 20 years. And yet we, as a body of governors of the system, just wholly ignore this. We're much more interested in talking about somebody's $100,000 contract than we are in talking about directing $60 million a year to ensure that our kids, when they enter kindergarten, actually come in ready, so that our teachers in elementary school have that much greater chance to ensure that all of our children can read at 3rd grade.
And to put it in context, if you look at that kindergarten ready number, and you look at every mark after that, from all the way to high school, all the way through high school until you get to graduation, you never hit it again. You hit 49% and you never hit it again. It always gets worse at every point along that trajectory. And what you notice is that if you split it up and say, okay, well, maybe that's those kids. Well, no, it's every kid. You split up the whole county into thirds, high income, low income, middle income, it's the same picture. You never hit that first number, right? So that beginning of that funnel is so crucial. It's so critical on starting out early. You think about, there's a book out there, everything I needed to learn, I learned in kindergarten, right? It's so important to get started early. And the data shows it, the research shows it, the stories will show it, talking to educators, sitting in classrooms. Every experience you have will show you that starting that process and making this experience count early is a huge lever that if we are able to focus on and get at least sort of right.
We need to make sure that we as an entity organize our resources much more effectively than we have before, and that's going to take discipline and strategic focus at the governance level that has never existed. And so this is why the home rule conversation is so important for us to have, because we as a community have got to say, these are the kinds of things that we need to do as a school system.
Guys, we have about 10 minutes. We got a bunch of questions people want to ask. So, Christine?
Here's my question for Rena, is it?
Mm-hmm.
What would make you, I want to take it back to the home rule thing just for a moment. What would make you be willing to want to have a conversation or establish this commission to discuss the home rule idea? Because right now, it sounds like everyone agrees the status quo is unacceptable. And I don't know enough about it to know what I think, but
A lot
I
of
can
people don't,
imagine
quite frankly.
that a local conversation would be more meaningful and helpful to the district than what's taking place right now, which is a state
I think
level
one of the
conversation.
things that, if they come out in the very open before they go and start get signatures, why has this process been so secretive? Why has it just been outed? When was the discussion started? Truly, the discussion started. We know there was something as far as just a few months ago in November, people started talking then. Why wasn't it brought out to a whole lot of people? Why a select few? Why has someone who has been known to try to go take education, public education, to the private side and to the charter side, publicly funding that? Why has somebody who doesn't even have an interest or children in Dallas been brought into the conversation with no one knowing about it? The secretive part even goes back to the hiring of our current superintendent. Only the school board knew who those, well, there might have been a few others, but not very many people knew, when this should have been a very open and public and transparent selection process. Most people had no idea until a lone finalist was named. So there was no conversation. If you're going to have a conversation, don't put it in the form of it goes to the public voters first and then we'll talk about it. Bring
What's
it
wrong?
out.
What's wrong with that aspect? Going to the public voters first.
Because the people that they're being asked to vote or sign something that they know absolutely nothing about.
Yeah, but nobody's going to actually be asked to vote until November. I mean, we're going to have a 6-month conversation in this city about
But
what
if the
we want to do.
If the signatures are there, then the board has to, if the commissioner approves it, the board has to appoint this commission, and there's no going back.
The board, for the first time in history, will actually have to start a conversation about strategically educating our children.
But look at the
I don't know why that's a bad
ramifications.
thing.
That's not necessarily a bad thing, but why could that have not taken place before it got to a signature.
Because we're lousy. I mean, like, that's the problem. We've been around for 20 years and never had this
But
When I
not
actually
conversation.
started this, I knew you guys keep referring to someone.
I
being
wish we
vague in the
knew.
but you guys seem to know somebody involved in this. Who are these people? Because you're referring to someone who doesn't live in the district being brought in. Name some names.
yeah.
Throw it out there because I want to know.
There's a group, there's a nonprofit organization called Support Our Public Schools that got formed by 5 people. 4 of the 5, I believe, are DISD graduates. 1 of the 5 has had all of her kids go through DISD. Those people are, you named a couple of them, so Louisa Meyer, Wilton Hollins, Steve Jones, Geronimo Valdez, and Gary Griffiths, if I remember the letter that the board got.
Yeah, Gary.
I'm involved in this because I happen to spend all of my time reading the law. And so I have had conversations with hundreds of people around the state about home rule, including those folks, and they decided to take the ball and run with it. The other person that she's referring to is a Hillcrest graduate, a guy named John Arnold, who started a very successful hedge fund. He now lives in Houston, and he's the Support Our Public Schools folks have said that he's their major donor through a foundation he and his wife run. So those are the people that are involved in it that I know that I can answer today.
If I could summarize, play devil's advocate on both sides here, because Mike, you're very much for this process. You're very skeptical that this is something that's going to produce a worthwhile reform. It's from what I'm hearing, and I would think the other side would say, Mike, you're so passionate about reform that you're willing to take money and interest from anybody and not question what their motives are. And Rena, your organization is so fearful of reform and what that means for teachers that you won't listen. That you'll look for you won't listen to any effort to do so.
If this group decides that they don't want an elected school board, then if they choose to raise taxes to get money for the schools or whatever, then there's no representation.
That also has to go before a vote. So the school board.
All of that would have to happen.
No, I'm saying the school board right now doesn't have the authority to raise taxes without going to the voters. So
Correct.
For example, every time we go for a bond, that's got to go for the voters. Anytime we change the tax rate upwards to fund more teachers,
But a
that's gotta
charter
go
school
before the
doesn't
board.
have to do that.
Charter schools, this
They
is not a
are
charter
publicly
school.
funded. But the home rule charter makes it more of a privatization rather than a public entity.
Well, so
The due
term-
process rights could be done away with student discipline for students, for parents, for educators. That could be done away with because it costs money for the legal process. Dallas spends millions of dollars in legal processes where if you follow the law, you wouldn't have to file grievances or go that route.
Terry, from the outside, do you have a position on this?
No, we don't. I mean, and Commit's interest is about using data and community expertise to figure out what we can do better. We have no interest in governance, in school governance. That's not an arena that we play in. Our interest is on what we can do for the children using all the information that we can gather and all the community expertise we can bring to the table.
I know we've got to wrap up. I'm going to ask one last question, just because I know a lot of people have asked this. Can you talk? The central argument at this point does seem to be about the secrecy of this effort and that it was sprung on the public, and that people are not talking to the mainstream media about why it is they're involved, what it is their ultimate goals are, et cetera. Is that a valid criticism, and why or why not?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid criticism. I got a ton of calls on Monday from every reporter in town, and my dad was in surgery, so I didn't return them. For one day, I was somewhat unavailable. The 5 people that started Support Our Public Schools, I think all of those guys have full-time jobs, so they're normal human beings. So I would imagine they were not prepared for the onslaught of media attention that
Gary
came.
Griffith knows how the
Gary
media
was
He's making a decision.
certainly be prepared. But I would imagine that as I know that they've been given interviews. They just haven't been given every interview that's been asked because I think they're all working for a living. So I would imagine that as the process unfolds, they will be able to answer everybody's questions, because it's important to have a transparent discussion. I mean, if you're going to have a discussion about the way the school system works, everybody needs to be involved. It can't just be some small group of people. Luckily, the way the process is defined, the public has to be involved at sort of many stages of this deal. So it's not like this is going to, even though the launch of the conversation has snuck up on a lot of people, the conversation itself cannot come to fruition without everybody in town pretty much agreeing to it. And I think the final point in this is that there'll be a commission, so this constitutional convention, the founding fathers, as it were, and mothers, coming together to talk about what the school system needs to do. They don't get the final say. The final say has to be in front of the voters, and it has to be more voters than have ever voted ever. Because there's a quorum turnout requirement, and 25% of all registered voters need to show up in order for this to work.
And you have to have a majority of the 25%.
And you have to have a majority of those voters. So there will be more people involved in making this decision for the future of our children than have ever been involved in making any decision for the future of children in Dallas.
We've run over. Thanks so much for your time. Rena, Mike, Tarek, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.